Welcome back to Learning for the week of April 20th. This week we're looking back into Unit 8, investigating the interdependence among the living systems. And this week, we are looking into the relationships in an ecosystem. Let's get started. Last week, we spoke about what is an ecosystem and the difference between abiotic and biotic factor. Let's review. An ecosystem is a system where both living and non-living components work together to maintain a balance. Abiotic factors are non-living, like soil that you see here, and biotic factors are living, like a plant or an ant. As we see here, ants depend on its environment to survive. Today, we are going to look at the differences between a predator, a prey, consumer, and a producer. Let's start with producer. A producer is a plant that can make its own food through photosynthesis. Producers absorb energy from the sun and release or produce energy into an ecosystem. Next, what's a consumer? A consumer refers to an animal or organism that must eat to survive. There are three types of consumers: primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. A primary consumer eats plants and are called herbivores. A secondary consumer eats other animals and are called carnivores. A tertiary consumer eats other carnivores. Prey is an animal that is hunted and killed by another for food. For example, rabbits. Predators are animals that hunt, catch, and eat other animals. A predator eats prey. Most predators are carnivores, but some can be omnivores. Let's look at the interaction between different consumers in a food chain and a food web.
A food chain is how we track the energy flow in an ecosystem. In other words, a food chain allows us to see how nutrients and energy are passed from one living thing into another. We start our food chain with the energy source, which in our case is the sun, and then we move on to the producers, which are the plants that use photosynthesis to gather energy. Finally, we have the consumers, which eat the other living things for energy. The level at which these animals eat determines their name: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. If or when one of these organisms dies throughout the process, they can be eaten by scavengers like worms or vultures. Finally, organisms will be broken down by decomposers. Well-known decomposers include bacteria and fungi. Here's an example of a food chain. In this food chain, you can clearly see the flow of energy from the sun to the snake. Now, a food web is very similar to a food chain, except for the fact that a food web shows multiple paths of energy flow in an ecosystem. The paths shown are twisted and entangled, resembling a spider's web. Another important point to cover is the interdependence among these living creatures in an ecosystem. This means that the population of a species is dependent on the availability of their food or prey, and also the presence of their predators. For example, if the population of rabbits rose, the wolves would have plenty of food, causing their population to grow, barring external circumstances. However, when the wolves eat so many rabbits, causing the rabbit population to drop, you could expect to see a drop in the wolf population as well. The dependence shown in an ecosystem not only manifests itself in population numbers, but also through the relationships that they form. These relationships can be beneficial, harmful, or neither. Mutualism is a relationship where both species benefit, like bees and flowers. The bees get the nectar to make their honey, while the flower gets its pollen spread about by the bee, resulting in pollination. Commensalism is a relationship where one species benefits, while the other is neither benefited nor harmed. An example of this would be a tree frog taking shelter from the rain underneath a tree's leaf. Finally, parasitism leads to one species benefiting, while the other is harmed, like leeches feeding on your blood. Here is a chart distinguishing the relationships that we just discussed. Next up, we'll be talking about the trophic pyramid. The trophic pyramid shows the turnover rate of energy in an ecosystem. Stacked like layers, we're able to see the progression from plant to carnivore. At the bottom, we start with producers and move up each level based on the level of consumer until we reach the apex predators at the top. It is expected that 90% of energy is lost as you move from one level to the next. This is where we get what's called the 10% rule. So if a producer, which gained 100% of its energy from the sun, gets eaten by a primary consumer, then the consumer only received 10% of the producer's energy. Then when that animal gets eaten, the secondary consumer only gets 10% of the energy from the primary consumer. This is a picture showing you the loss of energy per level. After watching this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are the differences between consumers, producers, predators, and prey? What are the different levels of consumers? What is the difference between a food chain and a food web? And what is a trophic pyramid?